There seems something a bit rushed or desperate about the planning of Trump's visit to the UK, Trump's second state visit to the UK. And I think that curious urgency behind the United Kingdom's plans to bring forward President Trump's state visit is worth some speculation, or at least raising an eyebrow. I don't know whether I necessarily want to articulate any of the thoughts which are actually going around in my brain. In fact, I think I'd rather not. But why is there such a scramble to lock this in for September? And why does this seem to be happening against the wishes, we're told, of the King himself? We know that state visits are the crown jewel of British diplomacy. They're choreographed months, even years in advance. But this visit in particular has turned into a political and diplomatic balancing act that reveals more about Britain's current government than the monarchy. So, to go to the basics, a British state visit is not merely ceremonial, it's the most prestigious ceremonial honour Britain can bestow on a foreign leader. It sends a message of deep friendship and shared values. Traditionally, US presidents receive one such visit. If re-elected, they're usually invited for something much lower key, like tea or lunch at Windsor Castle. Barack Obama and George W. Bush both followed that model. President Trump, however, is being granted an unprecedented second state visit. And that alone is controversial. But the real tension is over when it will happen and why the government is pushing so hard to make it happen now. Reports suggest that King Charles didn't want to rush this. His advisers, aware of Canada's fury over Trump's talk of it becoming the 51st US state, cautioned against appearing to reward such rhetoric. After all, Charles is not just King of the UK, but also head of state for Canada. And diplomatic nuance matters. Charles himself delivered a pointed speech in Ottawa last month, affirming Canada's unique identity and sovereignty, and the palace's preference therefore was for an informal meeting, first perhaps at Balmoral or Dumfries House, to cool tensions and agree the shape of a formal state visit later. And that approach would have allowed the King to balance his obligations to the UK government with sensitivity towards Canada, but Downing Street was not interested in nuance. The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has clearly prioritised relations with President Trump, and his government, perhaps worried about the UK's post-Brexit trading position and defence ties, seems determined to get Trump on side as quickly as possible. That explains the sudden push to confirm a grand bells and whistles state visit in September, and Starmer even presented Trump with Charles's letter in the Oval Office in February, a letter not meant as an immediate formal invitation, but rather a diplomatic overture for planning. And this move, described by insiders as a cock-up, forced the palace's hand, raising expectations that the visit would happen quickly. There's also the problem of diaries. State visits are planned years in advance. The King's schedule is packed, including travel to Canada and personal health considerations. Trump, meanwhile, is expected to take time off at his golf course in Scotland this summer. Squeezing a state visit into September was the only way to avoid conflicting holidays and political events. But this rush has consequences. It risks looking cynical, a transactional deal designed to flatter Trump for economic and diplomatic concessions, to ride roughshod over the fears of farmers, and it places King Charles in an awkward position, appearing to legitimize Trump's Canada rhetoric just weeks after rebuking it. Of course, Trump himself is delighted. He loves the pomp and the ceremony. He wants to be the first US president to receive 2 state visits, a mark of exceptional treatment if he can't get a Nobel Peace Prize, and he explicitly rejected the idea of an informal summer meeting that might be overshadowed by a grand state visit later. For Trump, the bigger the spectacle, the better the headlines, and Starmer's team seem to have calculated that indulging this preference is a price worth paying. But there is a cost. For the monarchy, it risks undermining Charles's careful diplomacy with Canada. It risks politicizing the crown, which is supposed to be above short-term political calculation, and it may look like an act of desperation, sacrificing protocol and prudence for a photo op with Trump at Windsor. It also risks alienating allies who see Trump's language about Canada as provocative. and it may make Britain look like it's rolling out the red carpet, not because it wants to, but because it has no choice. In the end, this rush to bring Trump's state visit is about much more than scheduling. It reflects the tensions between a constitutional monarchy trying to remain secure, trying to keep its diplomatic integrity, and a government willing to use the royal family's soft power for its own strategic needs. It's a clash of priorities, symbolism, and politics, and one that tells us a great deal about where Britain stands in the world today.